Welcome to the Doing It Wrong podcast. I'm your host, Christian. Today, I've got Rob Sanders to talk about enterprise architecture and where we're seeing that in the future of that in 2025 with all the changes in technology that's and the speed that's happening. So thank you for joining me, Rob, today. Nice to see you.
Good afternoon. And given this is the You're Doing It Wrong podcast, and the topic is enterprise architecture, I think we can probably put two and two together there and have a very interesting discussion.
Yeah. I think there's lots probably going wrong there, but let's give a few minute background on how you got into enterprise architecture.
Excellent. And for those who will remember me from the prior episode where we discussed AI, glad to join with Christian today and yourself as the audience. Where to begin? As a practicing architect, I'd say I began as a data architect back in 2008, if you can believe, after about 10 years in software development and IT support roles and team leadership roles. It wasn't until about 2014 that I started to really look at enterprise architecture in earnest. At that time, I sat TOGAF training, passed the exam, became TOGAF certified, which didn't really mean I understood enterprise architecture so much as I could pass the exam. It took a little bit more time in that type of work before I'd even venture to be considered the title of an enterprise architect. So by that I mean I was a platform architect for some time, and at some point I made a transition from platform architecture to enterprise architecture. That's with both the theory, the certification, and then time in the job without the title, I might add, and made the step up into enterprise architecture and IT strategy. And I was performing this role at the Department of Health, but not in title. And really, the first role was head of enterprise architecture for the IT function at Raytheon Australia. I spent nearly 5 years in that role, further trained through the Raytheon Certified Architecture Program. I learned every architecture framework you can probably name during that time, including some of the more esoteric type training, including model-based system engineering. I was trained in Zachman Framework by John Zachman, who is quick to point out was more of an ontology than a framework, which is good to know. And I led an architecture practice for the time I was at Raytheon until my next role, which was head of architecture for the Department of Health in Tasmania. Started and built a practice from the ground up at that location, and left in, I think it was mid-2022. And I started contracting for the Federal Department of Health not long after that. And that's where I am today as enterprise architect for health business systems. And I also spent a great deal of last year as the Department of Health ICT governance architect, governance SME, if you like. So all up in terms of EA roles, hands-on, we're looking at a little bit shy of 10 years, depending on when you want to start the clock from.
Right.
And a number of roles, but as an architecture practice or strategy lead for about 7 years.
Yeah, nice. So you've been around running and establishing these enterprise architecture programs and the governance side of it, and I guess explain where the businesses decide, yes, we need enterprise architecture, but then pull the rug underneath it, right? So,
well, it's a great segue into one of the topics that I wanted to get to today, which is how enterprise architecture, in broad terms, has an identity crisis. And it's no small, in due part to, I think, the variable nature of what that is, particularly by people who aren't trained practitioners. And the thing about enterprise architecture is you don't necessarily need to be TOGAF certified. You don't it helps, like anything, to have a common understanding. But enterprise architecture at its heart is about the organization where you are working. It's not a homogenous concept, at least not in terms of its heart. So you can move between organizations and come across similar processes, frameworks, similar tools, repositories, and so forth. But it's about business strategy uh, at its center. And this is, I think, where we lose businesses to some degree. So they may grow to a certain size and then decide, hey, we're big enough now. We need someone to perform an enterprise architecture function, and they might consider that to be a growth step. And I'd say for a lot of businesses, that's probably true. At a certain point, when you move from being small to a medium-sized organization, you reach a certain inflection point where you have to do things somewhat differently in order to maintain growth or to better refine your processes or the business you're performing. In others, they seem to acquire EA as more like a platform architecture type role. This is someone who is an architect, but architects across the entirety of their technology landscape. And again, it's not necessarily a wrong definition, but it is a bit different than someone who is writing platform designs, platform architecture. There's still a predominant technology focus or an SME focus, as opposed to being somewhat technology agnostic. And this is the what's the word, I've got a mental blank. The notion that's often most argumentative in architecture circles is EA predominantly a technical discipline, or is it strategic discipline?
Yeah. And I think we both side on I think it's more of a business function, not a technical function, and that's where a lot of the IT leaders go, stay in your lane, stay technical, and he goes, well, I don't think that's the best place for it. But
it doesn't help that it originated in technology areas originally. If you go back to the 90s and prior, or even in the early 00s, enterprise architecture kind of evolved out of better needing to understand how technology supports and underpins business processes and business outcomes. And it's still very much the case. But often when you go into a large organization or any organization that has an EA practice, you find it under an IT function or under an IT BU. And it tends to constrain how people see the EA itself. They don't understand why they would have a business strategy discussion with someone in IT, especially if the view of IT as a function is more of a support or an enablement function rather than something that contributes to bottom line or approach to market and things like that. And so you often find business strategy divorced from EA because one's under the COO or something like that, and EA is under the CIO.
Yeah.
Really, the success is to blend the two and to say that your strategy should be taking advantage of IT enablement, and IT needs to understand what the business goals, business outcomes, business strategy is in order to deliver better support, better enablement. So in some large organizations, they've seen this, and EA reports more into a COO type environment or a leadership environment. And in others, they still, it's sort of still that senior progression career-wise from people up from a tech lead to a domain architect and so on. So there's no right or wrong answer. I think it's more a question of how effective is your EA.
Yeah. And it kind of begs the question, is it better to have a technologist become an EA or a business person become an EA? And I see lots of, they try to just throw in any technology person that's been around for quite a while and just go, oh, well, he's been around for a while, he can be our EA. Like, well.
Yeah, it probably depends on who you have in your organization. If you've got really strong technology people who understand how technology is deployed and you bring a strong business person in, then that could equal strong success. It probably doesn't work so well if you throw really strong technical people at a business area and they don't have the soft skills or the ability to relate or understand how a business operates, or vice versa. You throw business-centric people in with technology people, and they don't know how to translate from technology to business and back.
Yeah.
Any of those scenarios will probably lead to a mismatch. And so that's part of the problem with EA, is that there's so many right and wrong combinations, and none of them are necessarily right or wrong for any given organization.
Yeah.
But I suppose at the end of the day, it is still somewhat human-centric. We really rely on being able to work with others, and inform people, work with them, collaborate. In that way, EAs end up being more like diplomats in a sense. There's a lot of grouping people together to work on a common problem. And it takes you out of your swim lane if you're coming from a solution architecture or a technical team lead background, because you may prefer to focus on the technology, on the tools, and don't want to go into that realm. But in my experience, you have to be successful. You kind of have to do both. You need to be able to look and understand the technology environment very clearly. I think it helps to be a technology practitioner.
Yeah.
But you can't ignore the currents within an organization that could be political, it could be other factors. And the best way to achieve success is to work with people to unblock issues or to promote capability outcomes. So you do become a little bit of a salesman as well, which is, well, the better ones do.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had a few problems where, you realize that the businesses come to you and they want you to implement a technology to solve the problem, but really it's a business problem. It's not a technology problem. And until they solve their business process and the way and their business goals, doesn't matter what technology you have, it's not going to fix it, because they'll just keep doing the same thing. But they kind of go, well, you're a technology person. Why are you telling me how to do my business side? I'm telling you I need this platform. And you go, well, it's not going to solve your problem, but we can do it. But I guess getting that, and I think that, that optics of what enterprise architecture can do from the business side, is still needs a little bit of PR, I guess you could say, or change of the mindset on the business side.
And you're right, it happens a lot, and for various different reasons. Sometimes it's people have gone to a trade show and a salesperson's managed to put the right product in front of the right person at the right time, and come back from it thinking, yep, this is going to solve my problem. Or in other cases, it could be they've seen somewhere else using a type of technology or a product, and they've said, hey, that'll work great here as well. And so you end up with a lot of these ideas coming in. They usually don't understand the full complexity or scale of of the environment they're trying to bring these things into, and that can be problematic. It gets interesting at times when a non-technical area presents a technology solution to people who do it as their full-time job. They're technology SMEs, and you can get that friction that says, well, we're kind of the experts in this. You should really listen to us.
Yeah.
Our job is to make sure you're successful. And we don't write policy, or we don't tell you how to perform a business function. Why are you kind of telling technology people how to do technology? So, as an EA, you need to get in the middle of that and stop that. So not necessarily tone police it, but kind of reduce that argy-bargy to one side and say, well, hang on, let's look at what's motivating them to want a specific product or specific technology, and then have a close look and see whether it is actually the best solution for the problem they're trying to solve. Or look at what you already have. In a lot of cases, we see duplication of capability all the time. People have come in and they've got a problem. You look at it and go, yep, we can solve that, but we actually have 4 products that already do pretty much what you want. And again, the big benefit of EA is to better organize your understanding of what you already have and optimize it accordingly. And this speaks volumes to upper management who are very interested in things like reduction of technical debt and reducing run or keep the lights on cost. So we play a pretty important role there in trying to maximize and consolidate capability, not just because it usually means better quality capability, but pooling it also means potentially cost reduction and reduction in so many other concerns that people don't necessarily consider all the time, like the support overheads, training, updating processes, SOPs, those sort of things. And we take that all into consideration. We don't necessarily share it all with everyone. And I think that's another thing that people don't necessarily appreciate for EA is that we have to apply different stakeholder views in everything we're doing. We don't just produce technical material for technical people, C-level material for executives, or business process focused outcomes for the business. We service all of those viewpoints generally across the board. And the bigger the capability, the more work we do as enterprise architects to be able to explain the value proposition mostly. When you're in another job, you can tend to focus specifically on your own area. If you're producing technical material, that can be pretty well defined. You rarely have to explain it to, say, a CIO and potentially not business users as well. So it's a somewhat unrewarding job at times because this nebulous concept of EA means that people tend to cast their own ideas about what EA is onto you and say, you're EA, we expect you to have this magic. And the broader problem with that is that I find EA tends to be under-resourced in most environments relative to the expectation. So the better places actually have a defined practice and representation, not just of EA, but domain architecture as well. And that way you can cover off as many bases as you have resourcing. So the best thing to do would be to establish what is it EA does. Get it really clear. So when people come to you, that if they're expecting you to be maintaining, say, a CMDB or something, you might say, well, that's not actually EA's responsibility. We can point you in the right direction. But if that is an expectation, EA, for some reason, performs and maintains a CMDB, okay, fine. Make sure it's resourced appropriately. And then it's your responsibility to make sure it's up to date and relevant and providing value. So that therein lies the challenge. What is EA to any given person? And are their expectations valid or reasonable? That's our constant battle.
Yeah. You touched on earlier something I wanted to really point out was a lot of times it's the best thing to do is optimize what you have, not necessarily go out and procure something new. But I think that's also hard because companies like a shiny new thing, and especially not just shiny new things, but now cloud new things, right? And look, there's amazing cloud software out there, right? But it does take a shift if you're not already fully cloud or lots of apps in the cloud when you're a business and you're trying, your users are starting to come to you and saying, I want cloud stuff. That takes a shift in mindset. And so you can't just say, well, let's optimize what we got because, the customers, who are the business users are starting to ask for, these cloud applications that it basically speeds up their work and for good reason. So not saying don't do it, but segues into my next point is you need a cloud mindset. And it's something that actually I hadn't really thought so much about, but I had a meeting with SAP, sort of a discussion on one of their webinars, and it was talking about how you get across some of these ideas like data governance and data ownership and things like that. And they said, well, actually, we run cloud mindset workshops with their customers before they implement. And it's, you know, it's amazing to see that, oh yeah, people, they're hitting the same problems, because, you know, companies go in and go, yeah, sure, we'll get a cloud application because you want it and do it, but then they try to customize it to all ends because they want it to act and function and have all these same qualities that they had on their on-prem. But cloud doesn't work that way. So I guess where's that? Do you see EAs playing a role in that cloud mindset to kind of change the business and IT leadership's understanding of what it means to move to that?
It's a problem we've had for a long time, and to appreciate how difficult it is, if you look back at how we used to manage these things, and if you're in a large organization, this wouldn't be a surprise. We used to do it through managing technology standards. So when someone wanted something, it would be fully evaluated. There'd basically be a business case behind it, and eventually it would be approved, and then people in the organization could use agreed published technology standards, and that really worked fine up until the era of the cloud, when you were constrained in how you got software or hardware. And it was a lot easier to say, you know, you can't use something until it's been approved. But in fact, even prior to cloud, that was already starting to show signs of wear and tear because of the rate of change and the number of different versions of something that would come out. It was just impractical for someone to go and do a complete sanity check of a software package end to end. So the times have changed, and so the approach has to change as well. And with cloud, I think what it probably provokes is more, you probably want to consider that software, hardware, or service could be location agnostic. It could be in the cloud, it could be on-premise, could be hybrid, could have multi-cloud capability. These are all things that are valid expectations. So the question becomes, how do you have a handle on these things? And it probably relates more to your organization's strategic view. That is, do you want to align business operations, say, against specific platforms? Do you want to align the technology against value stream alignment, or do you want to take a more traditional view where you align technology to something like an org structure? And also how you apply the organization's processes to the establishment, the acquisition, and sustainment of said technology capability. Bear in mind that there is not necessarily a wrong answer here. It entirely depends on where you are. If you unpack that, there's ways of doing this. What I've seen in practice is that we've started to move away from concerns about specific software and specific services, and they've turned into more safety guardrails, governance type discussions. For example, if a business area wants Google Cloud and they want a sandbox environment because they don't know what they want, and that they don't know what capabilities or services they want to consume, but they've got, say, data analysts or data architects, and they want to do some machine learning. They want an environment that they can use that's fairly unconstrained. Traditionally, that's a problem because it could lead to all manner of issues. So instead of saying, well, rather than we approve a service or we approve some software, you know, like the old way, is instead we say, okay, here's how we're going to safeguard the environment so that you have something that you can use that meets your expectation, you can ideate in it, but it also reduces the potential of things like information exfiltration or accidental leakage. And the challenge is that it requires a lot more forethought and foresight, because you now have a requirement to build safe sandboxes. And if that hasn't been part of the agenda, if you haven't had funding or haven't had the ability to consider it, you might be on the back foot here. And what we're finding is shadow IT tends to power the purchasing of subscriptions that a central IT function has no idea about, and leads to things like sensitive information being put in environments that are completely insecure. So we want to avoid that because we know it can happen. and be able to answer the business requirement with something that it usually borders on a compromise. It usually means they don't quite get everything they would like to do, but they do get backed by the confidence that if the environment gets blown away, someone knows how to restore it, or they know how to ensure that it's correctly secured. All those things that a lot of areas, honestly, they tend to assume happen. And unless you know about it, you can't possibly have the back of the business there and make sure that those things are considered. And I think part of the challenge here is it comes from the days where we used to stand up internal on-premise capability. And if you stood up a document repository or a collaboration system or environment, whatever, we did consider those things. Well, in the good places, they did. You'd have a DR, you'd have an understanding of business criticality, you'd understand business continuity, and you could say, you can depend on the system because we've done the due diligence. When you stand up ad hoc capability, you don't necessarily get it. But the consumers of it don't necessarily know that because they're used to things having that level of review and compliance applied to it. And it doesn't necessarily occur to them that if you haven't engaged someone who is in, say, corporate IT or in an IT function, that this may not even be on their radar. But the expectation's there. So I think I kind of lost the original point here, but how do you adapt to managing these things in in an environment that sort of requires a more agility?
Yeah,
I think that's the key. Understand the business context, and also have a plan for how you actually align technology, whether that's value stream aligned, platform aligned, or the traditional model. And it helps set the context for EA as well. The enterprise architecture needs some sort of definition to really shine. And if a business and organization can provide it with a strategic alignment, EA takes it from there. And it allows you to be as creative as you like, especially value stream alignment. We don't talk about that much. And for those listening, value stream usually means that you adapt technology to a specific context of an enterprise or a business. It's something it does. And this is where we tend to break with traditional IT norms. So the old traditional IT mentality would be you don't need multiple CRMs or multiple document repositories. You tend to prefer everyone to use the enterprise one. Yeah. Value stream alignment basically says, well, a business needs are not always the same, and there can be legitimate reasons why those things may duplicate. And it could be regulatory or compliance related, or it could be security. You might need something that's in a secret enclave, for example. And it says you answer the business need with the best technology fit. You don't necessarily align it to consolidate IT because there may not be a clear and obvious business reason to do so. And so value alignment means you're being a lot more responsive, and you don't necessarily address some of the more traditional aspects of cost consolidation, license consolidation. Whereas with platform-based, you usually say, okay, if an area, say it's HR in an organization, we're going to put all of the HR capabilities onto a single technology platform. And the reason is normally that the capabilities on those platforms are complementary. So if you go into SAP, for example, there's a series of modules within SAP that works in concert with each other to supply a holistic HR environment that can include onboarding, personal management, PD training, etc. And you're going all in on that platform for that particular function. Okay, and it can work. There's no right or wrong answer there. Of course, the only issue with platform alignment I'd point out is that if you've decided that platform's not for you anymore, it can be quite expensive and difficult to migrate to something else.
Yeah.
There's always a pro-con to apply.
I kind of go to, I think the expectation was on-prem right? Companies would try to integrate everything. And now when you're going to that value stream view where, you might have lots of little cloud applications that really, do they need to integrate? No. So, why does it have to integrate, And yes, maybe you dump everything back to one central data warehouse if you need to, if at all possible. But if you've got all these little silos, let them use their cloud application because they're happy to do it. And unless it's business critical that it integrates, and it's this major function that needs to, stop trying to make everything integrate, I think. But again, like you say, it depends on the business and the situation. But I think it's that change of the mindset when companies go, "Oh, we want to get a new cloud app for whatever reason, but yeah, we want it to integrate with everything." I'm like, does your project management software need to integrate with your finance software? Why? Because the two, like anything that's a specific project management is going to be a tool. It may have some ends and it may do some cost stuff, but it's not a finance system per se. Mm-hmm. And even I've seen, some finance systems try to bring in project management, but it's also not great because it's a finance system trying to do a bit of project. And so there's different, it may be very good for managing the finances of the project, but not for the task management and what the, the project managers might need to do on that side. So, you may have some overlap a little bit and maybe some double entry in both systems at some point. But I think having a fit for purpose tool for that value stream for those project managers versus trying to cram everything into something that's not really fit for purpose but kind of does part of that is a waste, because then you're spending more time rather than those few areas where you might have to double touch, that you're spending more time in the one system but not getting any value out of it. So
I don't think people necessarily appreciate how integration can be a constraint as well. So if you have a large number of fields, let's say, that synchronize from a financial management system into your portfolio or program management tooling, and you lock it down so only finance people have ability to do something in finance, and you've designated finance as source of truth, project managers, program managers can't override or modify the fields in what is effectively their software. We're talking about something that is for a specific domain, and having to have those folks work with the finance team to resolve data issues or to fix values or whatever. If you're not calculating the cost of how often that happens and how long it takes to resolve, that needs to be calculated as part of the value of the integration, for starters. The second thing is, what's the cost of people who do manual workarounds when that process is too long-winded or too complicated, and so they start hacking around the system that's supposed to be for them, as opposed to saying, well, let's identify the absolute minimum number of things that need to be integrated so that we've accounted for the cost of what it means in terms of time, complexity, human cost, and the potential that people create a manual workaround or a paper-based workaround in some cases, and ensure that it actually makes sense, that there is realized value from it. And in a lot of organizations, this tends to exist where people implemented it and understood why it was that way. They've left. It hasn't been properly documented, and then people will just keep on doing it that way because they don't know why it shouldn't be done any other way. Yep. And you come in and look at it and go, I don't really understand why this is the way it is. And the usual answer is, that's how it's always been done. You really got to be less afraid to reevaluate it, because something was true at a point in time doesn't necessarily mean it's always true, especially if you've lost the original business knowledge. And it's one of the biggest challenges in legacy technology uplift is you tend to find you've lost the SMEs responsible for how something works. And people are uncomfortable with making decisions or changing something because it might break.
Yeah.
But they've lost the original knowledge. So
Yeah.
the risk is already present. And we don't
Yeah.
know why a computer says no. And that seems to be the hard part of any large technology transformation is breaking eggs in a sense. You might do something, you might move something, and it may cause an unintended consequence. But I always argue that you've got risk anyway, that if the thing fails, you don't have enough organizational, institutional knowledge to ensure it comes back the way it should.
Yeah.
And it's not our job as EA necessarily to have that knowledge. I think we do pick it up if you work with enough areas in a large organization, or if you work in enough in policy areas, you tend to understand the nature of the business, but we're really more advocates for it rather than responsible parties. So you spend half your time just encouraging people to be a little bold.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. I kind of went probably on a tangent there, but go back to the cloud mindset a little bit. And like you said, like people just get stuck in doing things a certain way and just think that that's the only way. But with these new cloud applications, it's making it a lot easier and quicker to adopt these new systems and move to them if you're willing to do it the way that software was designed, right, and not customize. And I think where people are missing here is in the old way of thinking was if you put in a system on prem, right, the useful life of that was like 10 years or whatever. You were going to have that system for a while. But because you put in all this money and energy, but with cloud applications, you could probably go and say, hey, let's try this out for a year. And if we don't like it, we'll move to one of its competitors. And usually it's probably pretty easy to do if you're willing to be agile like that and look at things. But I kind of don't see. Well, I mean, I think there's some companies that are probably willing to test those waters, but then others being nowhere too risk averse. And I think as well going to the cloud and the new and even with, like you said, new software that might be multi-cloud or on-prem hybrid, you're shifting risk to that software vendor. And I think that's hard for a lot of internal IT and people to realize that, yes, we're used to securing things, and yes, we'll try and hold that vendor to some security standards, but at some point, the risk is on that vendor, and you're going to have to accept that. And it's up to them. I mean, and that's where you build the trust, and there's ratings, vendor ratings and cybersecurity ratings, and they go off and do their ISO certifications and whatever else. And you have to trust them. You have to shift the risk, and be, understand that no longer is your responsibility. You're responsible to manage that and make sure that they continue to uphold their responsibility, but you have to shift it. And so, I think that's a hard one to kind of get that mindset across, because people go, well, I don't know if I want to trust this vendor. I'm like, well,
it's interesting.
What are you going to do then?
So there's a couple of things that spring to mind. The first one is that traditionally it's been up to businesses and enterprises to decide how long they sweat an asset. So if they don't have any reason to change a process and the thing just does whatever it needs to do, we can happily sit there until it runs way unsupported. And the risk there is, well, once it becomes unsupported, we may not be able to find people who know about it from a technology perspective. It could have vulnerabilities that aren't being actively patched anymore. And a company or a business can make a decision about what their risk appetite is. And I've seen it get very unhealthy in some places, where the technology side is crying out, saying this is really not good. It's a huge risk, but there hasn't been any money or any funding or any appetite to change it. And the second thing is the accounting model that applies to technology has changed fairly dramatically. So the traditional model used to be that your technology acquisition was capital. And so if a business wanted something, they would get usually a fairly big quote. It might be in the millions, let's say. It's capitalized for something new. And then so the initial hit financially is that stand it up. And then its run or op costs can be calculated over how long they think it'll run for in terms of TCO. And it tends to be a lot less. Because the majority of the complexity time is in establishing it. And that relates more to on-premise, the traditional model. So your upfront might be the servers to put it on, various different things, a place to put it if you run your own data centers, all of that sort of stuff. Traditional model, large spend, low op. With the onset of cloud, it switched that around, and it became a lot cheaper to acquire capability because you could license software, license services with just a handful of users, build it up to an operational capability, and then launch into production. The majority of the cost is now when you assign access or licenses to your organization. So if you're buying 10,000 or 1,000 licenses for your organization, your OPEX has now sprung up because your capital might have been 10% of your actual ongoing operation cost. So cheap to acquire, more expensive to run.
Well, exactly. And there's companies moving back from the cloud as well because, that total cost of ownership, has gotten cheaper again. It's kind of gone. It was cheaper to go to the cloud for a little while, and then cloud costs have gotten more expensive and, come back on-prem. But then a lot of the software is now gone to the cloud style licensing of that yearly subscription.
Yep.
So you're kind of in this halfway in between. You're on-prem, but you're still in a subscription model, and so that can be taken into account as well. But and I guess that's kind of your point of if you're very platform focused and you've got this massive ERP, you're gonna have a hard time deciding where to go forward. And anytime you get a new value stream or a new area or some business function goes, well, hey, this system is no longer meeting our needs. How do you pivot? How do you pivot so quickly to enable that if you've been, running a massive ERP for 20 years and you don't really have a way to go outside that box?
How do you avoid building a Frankenstein's monster? That is, you centralize on an ERP, but to address changes in value stream, you start bolting on things that represent a subset of that ERP because it presents as less friction for establishing the function or the value stream. And so you might say, we're going to do a piece of our financial management in a thing, we'll integrate it into the ERP. Like SAP, for example. Yeah. And then you do this through multiple value streams, and you start to realize you can't make any core changes anymore because there are so many things bolted on now that you've lost the ability to understand what the implications of change are or change impact. And I'm sure this stung people with Pride S4HANA in SAP specifically because of the number of customizations or outlier dependencies. It became unmanageable. And so the nightmare scenario now becomes you can't upgrade or touch anything core anymore, which undoubtedly is why large government departments still in many cases run mainframes as the heart of their enterprise, because it's become impossible to be able to remove that piece. And in fact, it becomes very often an EA responsibility to come up with various different patterns to try to remediate. And I think they don't run long enough to be effective. particularly say if you're running a constraint pattern and say we want to eventually remove something, so we're going to effectively dereference it across the enterprise and point it at something new. How often have you heard that when the ultimate goal is to replace something else, like an ESB or something like that? Okay.
I think that's try to be realistic in the time frames for EA or a vision to make that change, right? Because once you have these massive embedded systems, the change doesn't come quickly. And you're on, it's basically, as I say, you put a 5-year plan in place, but you get a year into it and they go, why haven't you delivered? And I'm like, well, we're just on step one. So, is there a, I think, is there something, I guess it's managing expectations, right? So of the business leaders to say, this is not going to be a quick win. Yes, we could probably move quicker, but we're going to break things in the process. So what would you rather do, something slow and steady, or let's just break things and not care about the consequences?
This brings me something I really was hoping to bring up today as well. I want to launch straight into it, but let me just say, when I was a solution architect and later as a platform architect, I used to think I couldn't understand enterprise architecture. It seemed to me to usually be people who were ivory tower types that weren't in the weeds. They didn't understand the technology. And there definitely are some types. There are some folks who fall into that category for various reasons. But I think it was my own lack of understanding about enterprise architecture at the time. And once I learnt more, particularly not necessarily going through TOGAF, but through practice, once I understood what a whole of enterprise purview looked like, then I started to understand the distinction between a platform architect or a solution architect and an enterprise architect. It's not comparing apples and apples, really. An EA has a much longer view on things. They're not usually about the short-term turnaround. The effective ones are less tactical, more strategic. Whereas solution architecture and to a lesser extent platform architecture is more about solving a business problem now or in the now.
Yeah.
So businesses will often say, why don't I just get a bunch of solution architects and some technical teams and some delivery train and so forth? They see solution architecture and down as delivering them something now or something soon. They're directly linked to delivery. And there's nothing wrong with that, particularly if you have people in those roles and they're well understood. But they don't usually they don't usually lead to a strategic outcome unless there's someone marshalling and governing and ensuring that what they're doing is in alignment with what they're meant to be aligned to.
Yeah.
And that's where EA steps in and says, we play the long game, as you say. If you hire an EA, don't expect to see some output from them within, say, 12 months, because that's not remotely long enough to start making changes necessary or influencing change to meet a strategic outcome, unless you have something that is time-bound to 12 months. Like, say, Y2K back in the day. There was a pretty specific time you had to have everything done by. So with those exceptions, and they usually are exceptional, if you're talking about a business strategy or an organization strategy, they are usually slow burn type things with various different goalposts marked out. And EA plays a role in giving confidence to people that you're on track. Does EA do the delivery? Usually not. Does EA coordinate delivery areas to harmonize? Yes. And when organizations are building their strategic picture or doing their strategic planning, that's why EA is important to not necessarily drive it, but at least be in the room to understand why things are the way they are, why they're going to make an acquisition, why they're going to make a structural change in the organization, all of those things. And that's the difference. It took me a long time to work that out, and I've got the benefit now of over a decade of being in this space, and I had no idea looking in. So the message to people who are solution architects or platform architects who are wondering, why are these EA folks around and what can they do for me? The answer is context.
Mm.
The right people understand why things need to be done a certain way and can help translate what needs to be done and link it to why.
Yeah, this is a perfect, perfect setup, and you didn't do this on purpose. But something I was going through this week of decision being made in a project that goes clearly against the whole reason for the project, and you're going, well, that basically negates any of the value that this project was supposed to bring. And to me, I've kind of gone, well, let's change this. Every meeting, we're going to have a principles. Why are we doing this project? It's kind of like the welcome to country, right? It's a welcome to the principles of this project. Every decision should be weighed against, and managed with those principles and goals. And I feel like during the delivery phase, people lose sight of why they're doing it. They're just like, well, we just got to deliver. And then other people get involved and go, yeah, well, this is the way we've done it and we want to do it this way. And it's like, well, no. You aren't setting the goals and the principles. And let's remember, let's go back. So, my recommendation is every meeting, every decision, start with, the principles of why you're doing that initiative. But yeah, it's very, very frustrating to see people start to try, not understanding that context and wanting to make decisions, around it. And so it goes, well, why are we here? We should just go home. If then the initiative or the project doesn't actually achieve the goals it was setting out to, because you've made decisions along the way to basically hamstring it. So
I worked at Microsoft back in the OOs in the Solutions Development Center, and one of the key features of any project work there is that the project had a mission statement or a vision statement, and it was used to constrain scope creep. So anytime anything came up, it had to relate to that initial scoping statement, and it wasn't permitted to be a motherhood statement, because the problem with a motherhood statement is it can be easy to park all sorts of things under it if it's not sufficiently defined. So you would have something in there that says this vehicle, which is funded, has this specific premise. And then anytime anyone tried to bring something in that was against it, you'd say, sorry, this is not what this project is for. And it wasn't foolproof, I might add, but it did help, because, as you say, as soon as someone tries to bring something up that is clearly not intended to be addressed, you can just point to it and say, it's a great concern, but we don't have the mandate to address it.
Yeah.
And of course, you could always push that up to a steering committee or whatever oversight there is to say, hey, we've discovered something that potentially impacts this piece of work, but we're not authorized, or it's not part of our purpose. And then, of course, you can have people particularly change the scope or vision or direction of the project. Usually that would be your opportunity to fully qualify it as well and say, if you change something, here are the ramifications.
Yeah.
And it was quite successful. I still see a number of things that start off, and there hasn't been an attention to that conciseness, and then it ends up trying to bite off more than it can chew. And I think I won't speak to private sector, but certainly public sector initiatives tend to have this problem a lot, that they either A, don't survive a change of leadership, or B, the scope is too vague and people tend to be able to attach other semi-related concepts, and it ultimately stalls any delivery through it. But it takes a lot of experience and determination to keep things on track, and courage in some cases to go back to an executive stakeholder or an executive sponsor and say, we really don't advise that you make a certain type of decision because it will impact or hamper the ability for this thing that's been funded to deliver on its promise.
Yep.
And we don't see enough of that, really, because it is courageous to go back and say, this isn't what you asked us to do. And in technology circles, it's really tricky. Sometimes we pull from various analogies, and the common one is the building construction site analogy, that once you start building a high rise, it's hard to go back and make changes to the foundation.
Yeah.
And we have the same problem with technology projects and programs. And I think the lack of a physical, something you can touch, leads people to believe that you can make fundamental changes at any point and not have ramifications.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we're not
We
necessarily
heard that a
great at
lot.
being able to arrest it and say, well, we made a series of decisions based on something being one way, and you're now telling us midstream that something fairly foundational needs to change. There's going to be a lot of cost in making those decisions. And that's tricky. I've been in a couple of places where people have actually escalated up through the executive and been very pointed about saying, if this was some scope that was missed, here's what it will cost to address. And it eventually goes to someone who makes a decision and says either, yes, it is important enough that those considerations are taken on board, but we're going to make that decision anyway. But it just doesn't happen as much as it could. And I think that really plagues the success rate of IT, major and minor IT projects, pretty much everywhere.
It's a great point when you talked about foundational layers there. And I think that's a great one when you're bringing in an enterprise architect who can tell you what is a foundational element and where you really need to be sure. Because, I think some people think, like you said, we'll go, well, this was just one decision we made and now we want to change it. But he's going, well, that's on the ground floor. You made that decision, during the building, pouring the concrete for the foundation. And, we can't go back, now that we've built 4 stories, it's not going to be easy to change that. So having an enterprise architect who understands when it's a foundational element, can lead to not having to incur those high costs. And while, and I think this goes back to, that, where does EA fail or seemingly fail, and business leaders go, well, it slows things down, but it slows things down for these reasons that you don't have to rework it later because you thought about what your foundation, so when you go for, that's a perfect analogy. You go for building a high rise, and before they let you start putting one shovel in, you've got to have the full plan, right? And signed off by lots and lots of people. So, but that doesn't seem to happen in IT. It's just kind of, we'll just build it as we go. And I've done that myself as well. But, you live and learn, and especially with, larger organizations and enterprises, as, you get the foundation wrong, it's very costly to change that later. And then
it's shades of risk. You can run EA, you can run business and technology and ideation as fast or as slow as you like, but it's all relative to what your risk appetite is. If you're expecting something to succeed and it fails, and it's because there weren't appropriate guardrails in place, or the pre-work wasn't done, or you didn't understand, say, the things you might need to comply with, then that's your risk. That's your risk profile right there. The issue comes from this nebulous nature that EA is doing something, and then EA doesn't even know it's meant to be doing that, or doesn't understand that there's an expectation that EA has been across something and is watching it closely. So when we get asked to I don't want to use the term police. It's not quite what I mean. And I know EA can be used for that purpose. There are organizations that have that box that says, has EA approved this, yes or no? And it can be used as a way of shutting things down. I think that's a negative way of applying EA in an enterprise. EA doesn't want to be the cop, ideally. don't want to be the police, don't want to come in and say, no, you're doing this wrong, or you don't have permission to do something.
Yeah.
It's more about saying, yes, you're doing the right thing for the right reasons. You're on track. You're doing what you set out to do.
I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there, where EA comes in and may ask questions, and you get a lot of governance boards that just sit through the presentation and for the status of a program and never ask any questions or say anything. They just go, yep, okay, fine, move on to the next one. And it's like, well, are they doing their proper job? And I think they're hoping that someone along the way has kept the program in check. And a lot of times it's probably EA's unfortunate position to actually raise things. They shouldn't be the only ones, but it seems to me that is often the case where very few others want to speak out, even if they know that something's going the wrong way. But
have you seen? I know I have seen it in a number of organizations where there's a lack of understanding about accountability. Sometimes you vested in a CIO or a CTO or someone like that. They're the chief executive responsible for technical concerns. That could be cost, risk of that nature. And then the business side is usually a COO or someone like that who is responsible for the operation or the effectiveness of the organization. And where it comes particularly large enterprise, it's not necessarily clear which path those concerns should flow to and who has ultimate decision-making ability, particularly where you see a CIO subordinate to a COO in particular, and you're asking someone to countermand or make a decision that might be contrary to the person they report to from an organizational structure perspective. Most people would probably look at that and say, well, those roles probably need to be at level to make sense.
Yeah.
But an organization needs to treat its technology as being a fundamental part of its structure and not a subordinate part under an operations group. And you don't see that often enough, that technology is given its own position in the C-suite. And so you're eventually consolidating things like technology concerns under one executive, could be the COO, who isn't technical and doesn't delegate those decisions to someone who is. And so that person is then accountable for both business operation, business risk, financial performance, things like that, judge, jury, and executioner. Yeah. And for that person's own health, they don't have someone else counterbalancing it, separation of responsibilities, and saying at some point, two people should be having that debate and having, say, a CEO come in and make the ultimate decision. And this applies in the public sector as well, where I think the secretary of a department is the one who needs to make the overarching call, but should probably be ensuring that there is no single point of responsibility failure. But we don't see technology elevated high enough, which is unfortunate because it's so pervasive now. I can't name any department anywhere that isn't beholden to some degree to its technology footprint.
Quickly, while we've got a few minutes left here, I want to look at AI, and we've had a talk about that previously, but where does because AI, I think, is going to change a lot of the business processes, right? So, if we look at chatbots and how we support services, right? So it's really going to change that whole business process of how we maybe those support teams interact with their with the users that are asking for support. But and there's going to be other ways that AI is changing stuff and analytics and things. But where does EA, again, I think that the onus is on EA to move at a speed fast enough, because the appetite from the business side is probably quite large, over the past 18 months to adopt AI in some form. So, we talked about, technology standards as sort of the old way of doing enterprise architecture. So what is the way of doing enterprise architecture in the AI age? Where does that go, and how do we keep up with the pace?
It's going to be interesting per our previous episode. This is something that kind of breaks the paradigm. Like with everything else, cloud and other things that have come along in the past 10 years, there's been a way to address it by putting it under a capability or assessing it through a technology lens or an information systems lens, or however you'd like to look at it. AI is pervasive. So it's not something that you necessarily just pick up. It doesn't necessarily become something that you set out with a mission to adopt because it's inline. So M365, for example, you're getting it as part of an enterprise subscription, and it's there. And for most cases, it's just a matter of deciding to use it or not. And that could potentially be outside the call of an IT function or an EA. Anyway, businesses could be choosing to enable it, whether you like it or not, whether you know about it or not.
Yeah.
So I think it presents a problem in understanding where it's used, firstly, and why. So it's not too distinct from most IT concerns. Have credit card, will buy kind of scenario. So understanding the use case is really core to it. Where is it being considered, and in what context? And it's more a question of how can we help? Because I don't think if you're looking to restrain or constrain, then that's probably not the right approach. I know that a lot of people will go there by default, particularly in federal government. The initial posture was, we don't know enough about it, so we're going to say no to anything with AI on it until we have a chance to consider how we might adapt to it or put guardrails in place, which means that people just tend to go around it. Grab the corporate credit card, go get it anyway. So if you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem. So we need to be approachable on the topic and not be defiant in the face of that ask. The biggest challenge will be, I think, developing our own knowledge as well. And this is going to be a challenge because all the major players have decided they need an answer in the AI space. And for market differentiation, they've all adopted it slightly differently, even though some of it does present as common. And so it might come down to aligning it to value or platform, as we mentioned earlier, and trying to understand what the case is in alignment with the business benefit. And so if you're going the platform route, then you might decide, okay, how can we characterize what the AI offerings are on that platform and come up with a plan for who might make use of it in the most sensible fashion, and come up with a roadmap for it. And actually get on the front foot and go to the business and say, hey, the strategic orientation for you is platform-centric. Here's what the platform has to offer. These are things you could choose to adopt today, and will be the educated source of truth, the trusted advisor on how you would safely adopt AI on that platform. Same for value stream. Just replace platform with the area of the organization. And again, going back to leveraging current state, looking at what the technology partner has to offer in that space and saying, here's what you could adopt today or in the short term. And trailblazing ahead, understanding what the issues might be, working with business areas or policy areas to determine what kind of impediments might exist. As I said last time, there can be privacy and other implications that might prevent AI being adopted fully or partially. But being an advocate for how it could be adopted and how it could be transformative would be in enterprise architecture's best interests. Because if we're not the ones that people go to, they'll find other avenues. and they'll adopt it anyway. And then EA won't know about it or won't be able to advise business areas or organizations on what their risks might be or how they might better do something. So generally, I would say you need to be the first port of call, or you need to be considered that someone will pick up the phone and have a chat with you about it, and not push them through a ticketing system or some sort of internal process that makes it hard to get to you, which is a broader problem, not just an AI one.
It's kind of goes back to maybe 30 years ago when businesses did a lot of stuff outside of technology, and it was kind of up to these technology leaders or visionaries or what champions to go back and say, hey, guess what? Your fax machine, we can replace that with email. And being on the forefront of talking with the business users about how this new technology can help them and going to them rather than them coming to you. And I think that is something that probably, for the younger ones that weren't in that sort of digital revolution to begin with, to really understand and unpack that, we used to go out to the business and talk to them about their business processes and say, well, actually, we do have a technology that can help you. And, and I think that's where we're going with AI. Like you said, is we've got to be on the forefront. We got to understand it more ourselves. And then we're going to have to go and talk to the business areas and say, here's what we're seeing in AI in your area. And, here's where we think it can be good, and here's where we think there might be some risks. So let's tackle this together.
What a major point of difference between now and say 20 years ago is workforce digital literacy is so different now. Back in the late 90s, early 00s, we were dealing with a workforce that was evolving out of a paper-based form, paper-based process era, analog technologies. In 2020s onwards, 2010s, 2020s, as the older workforce retires and new generations come in, digital literacy is almost present by default. And so you've got people now in business-facing roles who already have a fundamental knowledge of how to use technology. They don't need to be trained so much. And if you're not promoting new ways of doing things and leveraging it, they'll figure it out themselves. They'll go and do their own research and come back and say, here's the thing we want, here's how it'll work. So, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it can be harnessed really positively. It's just a different type of friction is evolving now. It's not the teach someone how to use the basic technology concepts to help them with their job. We're now into finessing and saying, we already agree on digital productivity tools, digital collaboration tools. Those have become a way of life for the most part, or at least will continue to be embedded. It's how to double down on that knowledge and promote the exemplar in those areas because we've unparalleled opportunities now to really get into advanced technology use cases. I think from a CMMI perspective, if you look at technology in organizations over the past 3 decades, we've just evolved as the technology has, but as the workforce has as well. And the challenge moving forward is, how do you keep up? How do you keep innovating and leveraging your workforce, not just within IT, but the broader industry? And the second realization is, how likely is it that you could go back to paper-based processing? Because I think that's something we don't talk enough about, is in the old days, if something failed, you would revert to a manual process. If you worked in retail, an FPOS went down, you got out the old click-clack machine, you could still do credit cards. Is that even possible these days, given how technology-enabled everything is? Is there an offline fallback? And if there isn't, how critical is business continuity? And should you be asking your enterprise about that? Because I think your EA should have some pretty good answers.
No, well, all good questions. And, I think I think we've iterated the point of why EA is important. And I think it is also on the enterprise architects, as we pointed out, to be on the front foot in 2025 because things are changing so fast, to go out there and work with the business. Any parting shots?
Just one. It's hard for me at times. I do soapbox, but it's been asked a number of times about EA and proving itself, or enterprise architecture having to establish why it should be. And I think it's an important point because EA shouldn't assume that it has to be. I think enterprise architecture does need to make a recurring case for why it adds value. The challenge is it's sometimes hard to do that because in technology, in IT or ICT, in other areas, they have metrics that directly underscore what they're doing. If you've got a call center, you can see how many calls are answering, how many tickets are being resolved, how long it takes to resolve them. You can produce evidence that shows the effectiveness of how you're operating. Enterprise architecture, it's tough to do that. If we just simply did it based on numbers, you'd be looking at how many designs were reviewed, how many designs were implemented, how many risks were raised. Those aren't great metrics that show the value of EA. They show perhaps the effectiveness, or they show that EA is doing something, but the value proposition is a tough one. And so for anyone who's setting out to establish an EA practice or someone who's in an EA practice, I think top of mind should always be, am I articulating, or is my group or is my practice articulating its value statement, its value proposition clearly and accurately? And if you find the answer is no, you need to look at how EA is being perceived and how it's functioning in the organization, because it's right to say, what are you giving us? I think it's a fair question. And if people don't understand the answer, they're probably not engaging you for the right reasons. So that would be my final takeaway from an EA perspective is ask yourself that question, and don't just ask it once and answer it once. Think about it, not necessarily daily, but reassess whether that statement is correctly answered on a routine basis. It'll help ensure that all the stakeholders are being adequately considered, I think, and to ensure that you have a reasonable handle on the perception of what EA's value is and what it does for the organization or for a business. That would be my number one piece of advice.
No, I think that's a good point. To keep, and I think you made it also at the beginning of saying, what is the role of EA for that enterprise and that business? And I think there's a periodic review of continuous improvement, to understand, okay, has the role of EA changed in the business or the need of the business, because maybe you were in a technology transformation phase earlier, but now you're not. So does the EA need to change along with it? So, very good point to make sure you're relevant to the business. Thank you, Rob. If you have any questions for Rob or myself, please place them in the comments section. Also, you can order some swag, and I'll put links to that. But thank you very much, Rob. It's been great, and I'm sure we'll see you back on the podcast in the future.
So, thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us today. And if you have any questions for the guests, pop them into the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe.